So today I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about engineering specifically and why engineers seem to ignore us. I'm speaking at it from both angles as both an engineer and as a manager. And so the subtitle, of course, the care and feeding of software developers. Just a real quick few things about me. I've been writing software since age 7. In fact, I got my first C compiler when I was 10 for Christmas. It was Borland Turbo C++. It came on 3.5-inch floppy disk. Actually, it came on 5 1/4 and 3.5-inch discs. It was awesome. And the manual was like a couple inches thick. The box weighed 10 pounds or whatever. It was back in the day when software was in physical packages and they were heavy. In any case, I started writing software a long time ago. Yeah, I'm the technical founder of Smarty, and I'll explain a little bit about Smarty in a second. And then also, I was born in Silicon Valley area. More specifically, I was born in Napa, which is just north of Silicon Valley. And so I have a lot of ties to Silicon Valley and so forth. So I'm super passionate about high scalable distributed systems. So, and we'll get to that more with Smarty in just a second here. So let's just talk about the company. First, I wanted to talk just a little bit about, we have some APIs that we do related to location data intelligence, including things like street address verification, street address autocomplete, as well as rooftop geocoding and reverse geocoding. So there's a lot of different kinds of things. Anything that deals with an address, we're really good at it. So, and then the scalability part, the software that we've written, that I've helped design, does millions of lookups per second, billions of lookups a day, and trillions of lookups per year. So one thing that we've also realized is, and by realized I mean we've achieved, is fully distributed across multiple regions of both tier 1 and tier 2 cloud providers. So the goal and the dream of multi-cloud, we are living that very much right now. So, and we've been doing that for a few years. And so the entire system we've engineered to be highly available. So that way, if it goes down, any one piece goes down, we're still online. And we've been running at 100% uptime year over year with 99.99% latency, which is an important metric. Don't ever measure latency by averages. It's a terrible way to measure latency. But again, under 50 milliseconds. And we're relatively small as an organization. There's 60 or so people. And there's people here at this conference, I'm sure, that have tens of thousands of employees. But the principles, I think, still apply very much. So we're going to talk about the principles and the concepts. So let me talk very briefly about a previous venture I was involved with. We had a domain that was very complicated, very involved. The minimum viable product took years to realize, to achieve, and it required deep domain knowledge. But at the same time, we had 100% rotation of every person, every employee in the organization. I put 12 to 18 months. It was probably around 16, 17 months. So every year it was just new people siphoning through, funneling through. And this would have been about 2005, 2006, 2007 timeline. And even going into 2008, 2009 during the economic recession, we still couldn't hold on to people in this venture that I was involved with. And it was very disturbing because the people that you needed to understand and to be able to develop the product, a year later, they just weren't around. So as a result of that, the company itself was stagnant. It didn't grow either in revenue, customers, or team size, the number of people that were working there. It was very stagnant, and it was not a fun place to work. So we had a critical decision. Did we kill this venture, or did we try to understand the real problems and so forth? And I'm not going to get into all the particulars of the outcomes of that specific venture, but I'm going to get into my journey a little bit more here. And so I was very interested in this problem. Why is it that we are losing people within a year to 18 months after hiring them? So I went back through and I interviewed dozens. It was probably 60 or 70% of everyone who had ever worked there. And I said, okay, and specifically engineers was the ones I was most interested in, because that was where a lot of the expense was in the traditional accounting style, the expense of training, getting people up to speed, the domain knowledge, and so on and so forth. So, why did you leave? And what were we missing as an organization? How were you treated? And what we found was that everyone felt mistreated. They didn't matter. They felt like they didn't matter. their understanding. They were told what to do rather than discovering the problem for themselves. They felt like cogs in a wheel, and especially like the concept of emotional and psychological safety. The idea that, and the reason I'm talking about all this right now is these are very real problems in most organizations. The idea that, okay, if I speak up, if I say something, that it's going to be, I'm going to be, it'll be frowned upon. In fact, I just watched a talk a couple days ago about the guy that created Microsoft PowerShell. And that was a huge disaster for Microsoft, but turned out to be a huge blessing in disguise, let's say it that way. The guy that worked on PowerShell, he was demoted. He was almost fired for it, then demoted ultimately, and became what's known as a pariah or an outcast within Microsoft for a number of years. But now, because of the success of that venture, is in charge of Microsoft Windows Server. This is the kind of stuff that you put on your tombstone, like I'm in charge of, on the front, I'm in charge of Microsoft Windows Server. And then on the back, you put like, it was a loving father and, and whatever. But he did something he did something and was punished for it. So oftentimes we're not allowed to bring our whole self into our organizations, especially as engineers. We have so much more innate and inherent talent, and we want to solve problems, but we're just not allowed to. So in short, individuals at this previous venture I was at, they were treated like things, tools, vehicles, obstacles, we'll get into that in a minute, instead of people. Okay, so this is where I had the paradigm shift. This is where all of a sudden the light started to turn on for me. And this was my first foray. This previous organization was my first real foray into any kind of managerial type experience. I was primarily a developer, software engineer, first and foremost at that time. So a thing is it's a tool. It doesn't have feelings. You pick up a hammer. It doesn't feel anything. It just is. And so it doesn't have hopes, dreams, aspirations, needs, challenges, objectives, etc. A thing, again, something that we use, a tool, a vehicle to help us achieve an outcome, or it can be an obstacle, something that needs to be overcome. And how often are we treating individuals like obstacles, or vehicles for that matter? But even within organizations, within departments, where if this individual would just get in line, we'd be able to achieve so much more. And that's not to say that doesn't need to happen from time to time, but it is to say by and large, we have these kind of viewpoints that we have of people, an understanding, a mental model of them where they're an obstacle, and that starts to leak out in our behavior toward them. How are we as managers, and by extension, I should say, how are each of us treating people as things? Do we understand the individual needs of each individual on our team? Do we understand what they care about, their hopes and dreams? Do their hopes and dreams matter to us? Do we even care? Or is it, no, we just got to get it work, to put your head down and get to work, and if you have a thought, keep it to yourself. And do these individuals, do they matter like we matter? So this is where I had this inner commitment all of a sudden through these findings to change. I really started to get curious again through these conversations. I wanted to have open, honest, genuinely curious, but genuine curiosity about each person in the organization. And it didn't matter in each of these cases when I was doing these kind of follow-up interviews, didn't matter how painful the feedback was. The pain of reality was so big in terms of the failure of that venture that the minute pain of the uncomfortable conversation didn't matter. In other words, I was so focused on truth that my complicitness in the outcome of the organization didn't matter. My ego, let's say, I set my ego aside and said, look, this thing didn't work well. So I was looking for those nuggets of truth. There's the little picture there. I was looking for the nuggets of truth embedded in the feedback. Now, that didn't necessarily mean I had to agree with every single thing the person said. Oh, I wish we had this. I wish we had that. I wish we had free soda like, Microsoft or whatever. I was looking for the kernel of truth of the individual didn't feel valued or cared about. Okay, so now let's talk about engineers just generally. being an engineer, and also again on the leadership management side, I kind of view things from the business side and from the engineering side, and I'm somewhat sympathetic. So just take that into consideration as you're listening to this. Engineers, we're kind of different. And what is it that motivates us? And oftentimes, and there's a great book. Oh gosh, what is it? I think it's Daniel Pink that talks about this. People are motivated by mastery, purpose, and autonomy. And in an engineering concept or paradigm, what that looks like is mastery just means being really good at creating software, working software. I want to understand everything about what I'm doing, and I really enjoy being good at something. Purpose could be the code itself. We'll talk about that in a second, or the business. Some people, joining Google in the early days, it was about changing the world. Versus now joining Google might be about machine learning, that they have more interest in machine learning or AI, for example. And some individuals, again, the purpose that feeds them is they care about the code itself. And these are things that you have to consider when you're working with an engineer. What is it that drives them? What is it that they care about? Again, do they care about being a really good engineer? Do they care about the perfect code and sitting in that nirvana-like trance with their big O of one algorithm that they've developed that was originally a big O of n squared or whatever. And of course, autonomy, being allowed to solve these complex problems without a lot of external meddling. And in fact, some of the coolest companies out there were 1, 2, 3, 4 people. They just came together and they just started building something. So you get 3 capable people and you build something cool, like GitHub originally, just a handful of people. Stack Exchange originally was Stack Overflow. It was 3 people. They came together and they built just a new way to communicate and share information. And if you're an engineer, you're very familiar with Stack Exchange in terms of being able to share code snippets and ask questions and so forth. The era prior to Stack Exchange was very painful, looking into forums and so forth. So 3 people coming together, working on something autonomously without a lot of external meddling, you can get a phenomenal amount of things done. So another thing that engineers are, we're just simply resistant to management. Let's just go into some of the reasons why. So you come to a company because of the this is a search replace thing. Their pay. You come because of the benefits. You come because of the company mission. So there's different reasons why you might come to an organization, but ultimately you leave because of a manager. In many cases, you're like, look, I just can't stand it anymore. I hate being around this individual that tells me what to do all the time. So, okay, we like solving problems, but at the same time, we also hate and despise organizational politics. Well, we can't do this really cool technical thing over there because so-and-so might be offended. That really grates against us. And we'll talk about some of that stuff in a minute about how to solve that. And also, just marketers hate this, but we have a high sensitivity to marketing fluff and an organizational smokescreen. Oftentimes we care about the algorithms and what actually is going on underneath. We like to open up the hood of the car and dive down into the car and understand what's happening. And so that's kind of what, again, what drives us and we're focused on. We're very detail oriented. When a missing semicolon can bring down the entire system, attention to detail is a very, very big deal. And not all engineers are alike, and some more so than others, but the code, bugs in the code are just tiny little details. So we learn to become attentive to detail, but that carries over into our personal lives where you start to nitpick other people. Okay, so now why is it that engineers ignore us? Well, let's dive in. So you interrupt them when it's convenient for you. I mean, how many of us have done this where it's like, oh, it's time to make the rounds. I'm going to go talk to engineers and so forth. Or the worst one now, engineers are more and more hating Slack and other forms of instant messaging, whatever the current iteration happens to be, Slack being the predominant one, versus a deferred, out of band, I can get an answer today sometime type of email. Or going to them in person, going into their room where they're working, and hey, I got a quick question for you, and bam, their entire mental stack is shot. And it takes them 20 minutes to get back, or 30 minutes to get back up to speed. In addition, a lot of times, because managers typically tend to suspect or try to infer your own motives as a manager. They try to, the engineers, we try to understand what's going on. And if what you're saying doesn't align very well, all of a sudden we may start to suspect and say, okay, what's really going on? And also, this is a fair statement, oftentimes a manager doesn't really actually know what's going on. And we'll dive into this a little bit more in terms of like the code and so forth. And sometimes here and there, you'll find managers can take credit for the work that was done. And that's something that engineers are very sensitive to. And some engineers don't like to receive public recognition. That's fine. And it's just kind of understanding the individual nuances. But also, we treat engineers oftentimes like objects, like vehicles, like, hey, come on, like we need you to get this code done. Come on, just get the job done so we can move on. Or we treat them like obstacles where, hey, man, I wish we could get this thing done, but Bill over here, and you constantly blaming another engineer. That's something that we take very seriously. So over time, the default mindset of an engineer is to distrust management. This is kind of an unfortunate thing, but go to engineering websites like Hacker News. You'll see this, and I'll talk about this in a second. But management is out to get me, kind of thing. I don't want to speak up. Again, Hacker News. If you go to any article there that talks about any kind of managerial philosophy, you're going to get hundreds or thousands of comments on these jaded, kind of like angry engineers. And that's not to say that they're right, and it's not to say that they're wrong. We're looking again for that nugget of truth. It's like, how could we have done things just a little bit differently with those engineers in order to have a better outcome? Again, we as engineers, we trust our skills that we have. We've learned a lot. We know how to code. We know how to build something from nothing, which is really, really cool. Like, think about this. Facebook didn't exist in any concept, now it's a decade ago, or more than a decade ago, 15 years ago. But it's like things that didn't exist now exist because engineers built them, which is so cool. And we trust our ability to deliver those kinds of things. And if management would simply leave me alone, I'd be able to write code. Again, these are the kinds of things we're telling ourselves. And that's not to say that we should be left alone. It's that there's ways of approaching us, and I want to talk about that in a minute. Engineering, like I said, it's a deep, focused. You got to get in the zone. It takes about 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes to really dive into the heart of a really complicated algorithm and tease out all the moving parts. We're not talking about 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, 4. Sometimes we have 10 different dimensions. And again, think in the physical realm, we can't even conceive beyond 3. But sometimes you have 10 moving parts all coming together. And sometimes that's even a low number. Sometimes it's a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen moving parts all coming together, intersecting in a weird, nuanced way. And you have to keep all of it in your head. And the moment someone taps you on the shoulder, the 36 things you were juggling or whatever it is, they fall on the floor. And you're like, great, okay, all right, let me answer your silly question about this or that or the other. Okay, let me get that TPS report to you next week or tomorrow on the new cover page. That's a movie reference. If anyone isn't following that, just Google it, TPS report. But then trying to dive back into that mental stack, like recreating that mental stack, it takes a long time. So it's really, really tricky there. Okay, so how do we turn it around? So why does management exist? Let's think about that just for a second. What is the purpose of management? And do engineers need to be managed? And I'm going to argue that we as engineers do, in fact, need some degree of management, but it's different in the way you traditionally think about it. Specifically, management exists to do the right things, whereas engineering exists, and we'll talk about this, engineering exists to do things right. Management exists to do the right things. Engineering exists to do the right things. And the joke we use is 6 months of coding will easily save 20 minutes of planning. And it's as opposed to, well, 20 minutes of planning will save 6 months of coding. So this is just kind of inverting it. It's just a fun little joke. And engineering, unfortunately, this is kind of a downfall of engineers. We like to be in the thick of thin things. We like it's called the new shiny syndrome, where we like to run to building frameworks and libraries and generic kinds of things versus very business specific outcomes. In fact, I'm just going to touch on this for a second. Engineers tend to like to build things that are generic in nature, that work with, they like to build things that are generic, where they would span multiple organizations. The unfortunate consequence of that is the real value for an organization, and the reason engineers get paid is to deliver value for that organization. So as an example, I can go to the open market and I can find an engineer that will build me a hash map implementation, or I can find someone that's going to do a logarithmic time sorting algorithm, or I can find any of those very easily online in any language, a programming language and or cultural language for that matter. So I can find engineers that can do generic stuff for very, very inexpensively. The reason engineers at an organization are valuable is because they understand the domain and how those solutions of, let's go ahead and say this kind of sort algorithm versus that kind of sortation algorithm, and how that applies here in what we're doing. Okay, so the role of management isn't to control engineers, it's simply to guide the process. So you're not the task master, as it were, trying to drive each person to get more productivity out of them. And there are times for productivity discussions, that's a different topic. But instead, you're helping facilitate working on the most important components. This is known as the big rocks. You can Google this. This is a well-known concept about working on the big rocks first. Okay, so we want to prioritize work as management based on desired business outcomes. If we don't do that as managers, engineers tend to wander into purely technical things, and I'm just as guilty as anyone of doing that because I love doing that. All right, so the best managers. What are the best managers? What do they look like? One thing I want to talk about is accountability in all directions, up and down the org chart. Typically, as a manager, you're like, oh, my engineers are accountable to me. But flip that around for a second. What would it be like to be accountable to your engineers? What would that conversation look like? And what would it look like if the engineers felt that you were accountable to them, where all of a sudden now the relationship is about collaboration, and even being accountable down, owning your mistakes to engineers, saying, hey, I didn't handle that well. And even things like, hey, when I have questions, how can I approach you? When I have questions about this, what's the best way to approach you about this kind of topic? And get their feedback and then follow through with that. For example, it's like, hey, if you're in the groove, how will I know that? And what's some ways I can approach you if I need something that's semi-urgent, but I don't want to bother you? How do we do that? And you can ask them. So also, I just want to talk real quick about trust and character. Trust is character and competence put together. So I trust you have my best interests at heart and you won't stab me in the back. That's a trust of character. That's the character component, but also competence. I trust you actually know where we're going. I can trust somebody to be a good person, but I don't trust them to be a heart surgeon. They may not necessarily have the competence. So you have to have both facets of this to really work well. So trust increases with managers who they have in-depth knowledge of the domain. Ideally, we're previously or currently software engineers. They get really curious about the goals and aspirations of each engineer. Those are the best kinds of managers. Also, they can volunteer, as I was talking about earlier, their own shortcomings and own up to them. Again, looking for that nugget of truth in the feedback. Like essentially saying, hey, I didn't handle this well. I need to do better here as a manager. To the engineers, that really builds trust fast. And also satisfying engineering requests as quickly as possible. When an engineer needs something, try to make it happen as fast as you can. Those are the best managers. Scheduling meetings on behalf of engineers, anticipating roadblocks, talking to other engineering groups, or rather managers, saying, hey, what are you guys working on? And helping everyone be aware of what's going on in an organization. And then ultimately caring deeply about the well-being. Okay, just a couple quick thoughts here lastly on career ownership. How long is any individual engineer going to be with your company? 3 years, 5 years? Maybe 10 if you're lucky. Okay, well, how do you get them to own their career during that span while they're with you, again, 3, 5, 10 years, let's say? Well, why not, this is an idea, why not work with each individual to figure out their career goals that are 5 to 10 years out? What do they want in their career, and personally even, 5 to 10 years out? Then, what skills might they need to obtain those goals. Okay, well, are there any of those skills that align with what the company's trying to do? And if there are, is there training that you could help the engineer or individuals get that align with both personal and career goals and company goals? Just a simple little technique like that, you can help people become the Chuck Norris, as we call it here at Smarty, the Chuck Norris of their own career and their own destiny. And all of a sudden, your paths are aligned in a much more interesting fashion, and the individual starts to own their career choices and the training and so forth. They start to become much more invested in their own career.